Welcome to the IR Digital Podcast, a part of IR Global, the largest international professional services network. I'm your host of the IR Digital Podcast, Jennifer Riggins. Today, we're sitting down with Judd Grutman, counsel at the Torrey firm, which specializes in employment litigation and advises management in improving workplaces and reducing unnecessary risk. We're talking about algorithms in the context of wage discrimination. We'll talk about what's happening with Uber and Amazon's independent contractors, which frankly are the majority of their staff, what's coming down the pipeline around regulations around these algorithms and workers' data, and how it extends to other industries and even salaried roles. Thank you so much for joining, Judd. Can you please introduce yourself for our listeners?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. And thanks again, Jennifer, for having me. Like Jennifer said, I'm an attorney at the Torrey firm in California. I specialize in employment litigation, but also have a lot of experience in litigating class actions and other bet the company litigation. And I also have experience counseling companies through state and federal investigations. My background, though, is a little non-traditional. After practicing for a while at a national law firm, I pursued my interest in criminal justice and found myself running an insurance startup that worked hard to disrupt bail bonds. The pandemic ultimately had other plans, but it's really helped me sort of hone my interests professionally. And I often follow a lot of tech and startup developments. And I think that's one of the reasons why I ended up being interested in this topic. Aside from work, I'm a huge horse racing fan, and I love to travel with my partner.
Very interesting. And certainly the work of tech and the work in tech affects all of us. So we need more people from more diverse backgrounds influencing the space. So thank you for that. Now, before we continue, I always like to ask and set the table stakes of who would benefit from listening to this conversation.
Good question. Certainly employers and business leaders, other HR professionals, but obviously work affects all of us. And I guess if I were working at a place that had algorithmic wages, I'd certainly want to know. There's also a lot of legal scholarship on this issue, and we might talk about that later, but that scholarship definitely presents societal issues that I think we all should be concerned about. So to answer your question, I think ultimately everyone.
Absolutely. And I guess most of us, or most of the people listening to the call, likely are customers of or users of one or more of the companies we're working with. So these are the largest in the world. So absolutely, we should be more aware of the ethics and legal standing of those companies that we are giving our hard-earned money to. What jurisdictions will we be talking about?
This is a new issue, so it really could happen anywhere, and algorithmic wages could happen anywhere in theory, but the focus really has been on California and Washington in the US, and in the EU and UK, there's a general data protection regulation that you might be familiar with, but all of these new regulations have some bearing on algorithmic wages at work, and it's definitely a developing area. In California, for example, there's a new law that went into effect in 2023, the California Privacy Rights Act, that gives rights to employees to access data that's ultimately used in things like algorithmic wages.
Okay, wow, yeah. I don't think you hear GDPR all the time, but you don't think of it affecting wages. So that's super important and interesting. So as a journalist, I really love a baseline definition. So for everybody listening, what is algorithmic wage discrimination in the context we're talking about?
Yeah. First, I think it's important to distinguish between algorithmic wages and algorithmic wage discrimination. Algorithmic wages at a high level are the personalization of your wages through the usage of an algorithm. And developments in AI and tracking have enabled employers to basically manage their employees through technology, collect data from them, and then generate wages through algorithms. In the context of rideshare drivers, for example, Uber can use historic routes, times, fares, and analyze that through machine learning to allocate rides and payments. But the distinction I want to make is that that's not necessarily unlawfully discriminatory, in the sense that it might not necessarily discriminate against a protected class of people. And as you might be aware, there's many classifications that exist across the world. So it's a complicated issue in terms of being unlawfully discriminatory. I think what scholars are really focusing on is that it provides unpredictable wages, and that variability is unfair. More clearly, I think the way to think about it is someone can do the same work at the same time as someone else, but for a different price, or at different times for different prices. And so that makes things potentially really unfair.
Oh, wow. And I guess that's also factoring in different locations, because driving a car in like New York City or LA would be much more expensive, just livelihood and life, than if you were driving a car, I don't know, in Minnesota, right?
Agreed. I do think that these algorithms take some of that into account, but one of the biggest criticisms of these algorithms is that it's hard to know what's really going into them and how the factors are being manipulated.
Yeah, the locked box that is our world in AI. Is it better or worse than humans making these decisions of payment, or was it not really human driven at all? Everyone just got paid the same, maybe varying by distance or location or something like that.
That's a good question, because I guess let's talk about outside of ride sharing, there is variable pay every day in all sorts of jobs, regardless of the usage of an algorithm. So to answer your question, I'm not sure whether it's better or not, but I think it exists regardless of whether there's algorithms at play. I think the bigger issue is variable pay unlawfully discriminatory in how it's happening at a workplace?
Fair enough. Yeah. And we know usually it's not done well. Let's talk specifically, let's zero in on Uber. What's happening there that's being specifically characterized as wage discrimination?
Right. And again, too, I want to just say Uber is a unique scenario, as we all know, in many ways. And you touched on this a little bit just a second ago. Uber drivers, as I understand it, used to be paid based on mileage and time, and there was geographical implications. Now drivers receive an algorithm-driven base fee that includes a lot of factors that critics often call wage manipulators, like surges and offers. And we don't know much about that. And so because it is opaque, it's hard to really know how much someone is being paid. People have tried to figure it out. That's definitely for sure. And they're still working to develop more transparency. What we've seen, at least from one group, and again, I can't verify this, but this is what they've published, is that Uber and Lyft drivers, after pooling thousands and thousands of rides and after allocating for expenses and lost benefits from driving, they netted with these algorithm-driven wages under the minimum wage and about $6 an hour. And this was collected from drivers in California. So that's really what the concern too is for many of these workers, is that here we have already low wage workers who often have limited means in challenging their wages and remedying their wages. And this is a further sort of layer of complication.
Is it different because Uber and Lyft are they considered employers of these people?
That's another great question and a hotly contested issue. But the drivers of Uber and Lyft, at least in California, have been deemed independent contractors. And so that limits wage and hour protections, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the concerns of algorithmic wage discrimination are at play.
Okay. And then, so there are groups, these are not just data pooling, but these are drivers pulling together, like the Rideshare Drivers United. Are there other groups or actions that are happening? Is this just something happening in California, or is this a practice across the globe?
It looks like it's across the globe, and at least it's heavily focused in Europe and the US. There are apps and other organizations that work to collect user data and driver data, worker data, to make better sense of the algorithms at play. They try to sort of reverse engineer how they're getting paid. They also often engage in legal action. And so there's pending legal action, even in California, that's challenging how algorithms are potentially impacting wages on antitrust grounds. So it's definitely developing.
Wow. And you had mentioned when we talked about this before, a concept of data dignity. What is that, and how does that work in this sense?
Sure. So data dignity, as I understand it, is essentially not allowing others to profit off of your own data when in fact there is profit to be made, or at least controlling your own data and the privacy of such. And I think that's where some of these orgs are at least trying to attack the problem, by creating alternative solutions that provide more dignity to the workers that are generating the data that the employers then use.
That's interesting, because also in this situation, they're individual contractors, not directly employers. So you would think they'd actually have more, the individuals, the non-employee contractors would have more right to their own data, because it's almost their private data, versus if they worked within a company and were doing actions within the company, you would think the company may have more rights to it. So it seems like they'd even have more rights to their own data in that situation.
It's kind of like how we talk about social media and our own personal data.
Yeah, which is a whole other quagmire we can go down. So I know in the UK, where I'm based, they have a union, I believe. There's a ride sharing union, and there's been back and forth with, at least in London, if they can exist or not, things like that. So how do these different unions affect, or are gathering people who, are they even paying membership to the union if they're getting paid £6 an hour or $6 an hour?
I can't speak to that, but my understanding is it's one of the ways that workers are harnessing their power to challenge these tactics. And so they've at least helped gather data to take legal action.
That's wonderful. That's really important. And it's definitely a situation that you would need like a very unique outreach to a lot of vulnerable communities in different languages. And it's very interesting. I had no idea this was happening, the surge pricing and cutting people off when they've worked so long, and then to cut them for pennies is just pretty gross, if I may say. Same question, different tech giant with loads of hourly workers. What's happening at Amazon? She says with trepidation.
So that's also a unique situation. And like you've been talking about in terms of independent contractors, Amazon has a really complex employment structure. And so they don't actually even directly employ or hire the workers. And so aside from not receiving Amazon wages and not being Amazon employees, they receive variable hourly pay based upon their routes and demand. And it can also include bonuses, as I understand it, based upon digital evaluations of safety, for example, or customer service. And so again, though, there's no transparency as far as I know into how the wages are determined. Although it is my understanding that Amazon has provided some data to certain organizations. But one of the arguments, again, about why this is so problematic, like you just were talking about, is there is this idea that, or it is happening, that bonuses are being throttled. In other words, when a worker is soon to receive a bonus, the algorithm is able to maintain them at a place where they don't receive the bonus, which obviously sounds very unfair.
You said for both situations that these were unique, and yet they're rather similar to each other. In this age of the gig economy, is it just that these larger ones, or at least Uber has quite a culture of open source or open data, so we can access, I don't know how much open data Amazon is releasing, but is it likely that other companies are doing this and maybe there's just not as much press or legal power yet?
It's possible. I've been saying unique mainly because Uber and Amazon are such outliers in terms of their size and reach and press, etc. But I think it's possible that this is happening other places. I'm certainly aware of AI being used to track professional workers like lawyers and accountants in their time so that they can better keep time. And it's possible that that could ultimately lead to variable pay. But the issue is, I think, pretty complex, and it's one of a lack of transparency too, and how to ultimately remedy what's currently happening.
So yeah, Uber and Amazon are uniquely global in scale and eating the world, etc. But they are also examples to most companies want to be an Uber or they want to be an Amazon in scale. So just because it is a problem that we have these locked boxes in AI doesn't mean that companies aren't aspiring to mimic and learn these lessons. And this will be taught in MBA programs soon as a good idea. Oh, Lord, help us. So, but for those that aren't sure, why does this matter? After all, these are people choosing to be in the gig economy and aren't going for salaried roles. So why does this matter in the greater scheme of things?
Good question, for sure. One of the big issues, I think, or at least what I glean from the legal scholarship, is that there's a concern that usage of algorithmic wages can really degrade the value of labor and how we interact in the workplace, and lead to things like gamification of earning wages. And so I think those things are very problematic potentially for all of us. Obviously, there's a lot of concern that we're paid fairly too. So these algorithms present some issues in transparency and additional hurdles essentially to determine whether you're being paid fairly. And so I think that's another reason why we all need to be concerned to some extent about the usage of this practice.
And thank you to those drivers for consenting to share their data in this research, because I think as a society, as global society, we tend to not, we have this awkward thing where we don't talk about what we're paid, which leads to wage discrimination across the board. So how is this form of how is this form of wage discrimination different from more traditional forms of discrimination? Just so we understand.
This sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier. These algorithms might not be discriminating or affecting a particular protected class of people differently. What's problematic, or at least why I think this is being called wage discrimination, is because gig economy jobs impact lower wage workers disproportionately, racial minorities, immigrants, and as a result can have highly racialized results on those, or impacts on those communities. And I think that's really why they're talking about this as discrimination. Again, because these are also often opaque, it's difficult to challenge them or make sense of them. And that's only more difficult for vulnerable workers.
Absolutely. That's a really important emphasis that we may forget, that when we are using these companies that we are often not looking at the face, even of Uber drivers, we should, and say thank you. How can,
Absolutely.
yeah, how can companies prevent this harm by algorithmic bias?
For sure. And I think that's really one of the biggest takeaways that companies should take from this is that there are things you can do, including evaluating and making sure that any algorithm you're using does not have adverse impacts, especially on protected groups of people. It's also really important to safeguard that information, disclose it, make it transparent where necessary. I think that's really coming down the pipeline. New York just passed laws regarding using AI in the hiring process. So I think going forward, we're going to see a lot more requiring disclosures and transparency. In this context, wage statements, utilizing wage statements properly is going to be really important. But again, and not to get too into the weeds, but in different jurisdictions, the algorithms themselves need to be monitored differently because the way workers are classified differs across jurisdictions, and the groups that are protected differ across jurisdictions. So monitoring those algorithms, I think, is going to pose a new challenge for sure.
And transparency is always, especially around wage and how you're paying people, is always a safer bet, I guess, right? Or from a legal standpoint, would you not recommend?
Definitely.
Thank you so much, Judd. To kind of summarize or wrap up the conversation, what is one thing that organizations should be taking away from this or keeping their eye on right now around wage discrimination algorithms?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a nascent area that I think it's important to keep an eye on the landscape. And what's come down the pipeline most recently is the Senate has introduced new legislation that would require disclosure of surveillance, monitoring, and other employer practices regarding the workplace. And so I think, if anything, what we know is that more and more is coming concerning how this can take place at work.
And it's just getting cheaper and easier to monitor people. So we need to regulate it sooner than later, or at least be transparent about what you're doing so people know what they're in for.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. I always learn so much from these conversations. If our listeners want to touch base with you to learn more about you, your legal services, or if they have some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. You can check us out, me and my colleague, Rebecca Torrey, online at the Torrey Firm, or you can email me at judd@torreyfirm.com, TORREYFIRM.com. Thanks.
And definitely scroll back down in the podcast feed because you can hear Judd's colleague, Rebecca Torrey, when we talk about how hybrid working has changed the business landscape. For the better or for the worse, you'll be the judge. Thank you, listeners, so much. These IR Digital podcasts are meant to be educational resources from experienced lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors. These trusted advisors that have extensive knowledge on topics you as professionals need to know about, especially when they're this changing and evolving. And to learn more about IR Digital and its services, please visit irglobal.com. Listen, there are a lot of good things you'll see in our most recent conversation with the founder. This is a really good organization doing stuff that benefits the world. And if you found this episode useful, please consider sharing it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.